Welcome back to the Genius Circle community and our comprehensive exploration of the inner critic. I'm Dr. Bren, and in our first installment, we discovered the foundational differences between materialist and spiritual approaches to understanding the inner critic. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most crucial questions. How does this powerful internal voice actually form? Understanding the developmental origins of your inner critic isn't just academic knowledge. It's the key to transformation. Because when you understand how something was created, you gain insight into how it can be recreated differently. In this second part of our series, we'll explore the psychological mechanisms that turn external criticism into internal criticism, examine the crucial early developmental stages where the critic takes shape, and understand why some people develop harsher critics than others. This knowledge will give you the foundation for recognizing your own critic's patterns and beginning the work of transformation that we'll explore in future installments. So let's begin by understanding the psychological mechanics of how external voices become internalized as the inner critic. Before exploring specific developmental stages, it's essential to understand the psychoanalytic framework that explains how external voices become internalized as the inner critic. Freud and his followers identified introjection as the crucial defense mechanism in the formation of the superego. Introjection occurs when a child takes in or swallows whole the attitudes, values, and judgments of significant others, particularly parents and authority figures. This isn't a conscious process, but rather an automatic psychological defense that helps the child manage anxiety and maintain attachment bonds. Think of introjection like this. Imagine a child repeatedly hearing, "You're so careless," from a frustrated parent. Rather than simply remembering these words, the child's psyche incorporates this evaluative voice into their own mental structure. The external critic becomes an internal critic through this unconscious psychological process. Through introjection, external criticism becomes internal criticism. The critic is thus built gradually through thousands of such introjections over the course of childhood and adolescence. Supporting defense mechanisms. Other defense mechanisms also play important roles in critic formation. Identification. The child identifies with the aggressor or authority figure as a way of gaining a sense of control and reducing anxiety. By becoming like the critical parent, the child gains a sense of power and predictability. Projection. Unacceptable aspects of self are projected outward, creating a hostile external world that justifies the critic's vigilance. "Everyone is judging me" often reflects projected self-judgment. Splitting. The world is divided into all good and all bad categories, creating the binary thinking characteristic of the harsh critic. There's no middle ground. Things are either perfect or terrible. Idealization. Perfect ideals are constructed, against which the self is inevitably found wanting. The critic uses these impossible standards as ammunition for its attacks. Understanding these defense mechanisms helps explain why the inner critic isn't simply a collection of memories, but an active, autonomous feeling presence within the psyche. It literally becomes part of the person's psychological structure. Erikson's Freudian Foundation. While Erik Erikson worked within the Freudian tradition, he expanded psychoanalytic theory by emphasizing social and cultural influences on development. Though he maintained the materialist worldview we discussed in Part 1, his psychosocial model provides valuable insight into how the superego or inner critic forms during the first 3 developmental stages. Erikson's genius was recognizing that the child's environment and the quality of early relationships fundamentally shape how the superego develops. Let's explore how each of the first 3 stages creates specific patterns in the inner critic. Stage 1. Trust versus mistrust, 0-18 months. During this foundational stage, infants develop a basic sense of whether the world is reliable and safe or unpredictable and threatening. When caregivers respond consistently to needs with warmth and reliability, basic trust develops. However, inconsistent care, neglect, or abuse creates a foundation of mistrust. The defense mechanism in action. The defense of splitting is particularly active here, dividing experiences into completely safe or completely dangerous categories with no middle ground. The infant's nervous system learns to categorize the world in black and white terms. The introjected critic. The critic that forms from mistrust carries these messages. The world is unsafe. You can't rely on others. You must remain hypervigilant at all times. Letting your guard down leads to abandonment. Others will leave when you need them most. This critic constantly scans for danger and questions others' intentions, even in safe situations. It operates from a baseline assumption that disappointment and abandonment are inevitable. Stage 2. Autonomy versus shame, doubt. 18 months, 3 years. As toddlers begin to exercise independence and control over their bodies and environment, they develop a sense of autonomy. This is the stage of toilet training, walking, talking, and asserting the word no. When caregivers support appropriate independence while maintaining necessary limits, children internalize a sense of capability and self-control. The defense mechanism in action. Identification with the shaming parent becomes a powerful defense here. By becoming one's own harshest critic, the child gains a sense of control over the shaming experience. If I criticize myself first, maybe they won't. The introjected critic. When caregivers shame children for accidents, normal developmental struggles, or expressions of autonomy, children introject this shaming voice. Your impulses are wrong and disgusting. Your body is shameful and unreliable. You're incompetent without constant guidance. Your desire for independence is selfish. You should be ashamed of your mistakes. This critic specializes in shame about the body, natural impulses, and any expression of personal will or autonomy. Stage 3. Initiative versus guilt. 3 to 5 years. Children in this stage begin to initiate activities, explore their environment, and test their power in the world. They develop imagination, curiosity, and a sense of purpose. They need support for their natural creativity and emerging leadership abilities. The defense mechanism in action. Introjection is particularly strong here as the child takes in the moral judgments of parents and begins to enforce them automatically. The child becomes their own moral police officer. The introjected critic. When children's initiatives are consistently met with criticism, warnings of danger, or moral judgments, they introject a guilt-inducing critic. Your impulses are dangerous and will hurt others. Your desires are too much and selfish. You should feel guilty for wanting anything for yourself. Taking initiative leads to trouble. It's safer to wait for permission than to act. This critic specializes in guilt about personal desires, ambition, creativity, and leadership. It convinces the person that their natural impulses are inherently problematic. These early experiences form the initial structure of the superego, which later becomes more elaborate through continued social learning. The quality of these early introjections fundamentally shapes whether the inner critic will function as a harsh, punitive presence or a more balanced, guiding voice. Importantly, most people carry elements from all 3 stages. You might have a critic that combines mistrust, others will abandon you, shame, your needs are disgusting, and guilt, your desires hurt others. Understanding which themes are strongest in your own critic provides a roadmap for healing. The inner critic takes shape largely through internalizing the voices of authority figures, particularly parents or primary caregivers. But here's what's crucial to understand. Children absorb not just what parents explicitly say, but how they respond emotionally to behaviors, what they model in their own self-talk, and the underlying attitudes they carry. Direct transmission, explicit criticism. You're so clumsy. Why can't you be more like your sister? Conditional approval. I love you when you're good. Mommy is proud when you get A's. Perfectionist expectations. Good enough isn't good enough. Winners never quit. Indirect transmission. Parental self-criticism. Children absorb how parents talk to and about themselves. Emotional responses. A parent's disappointment or anxiety becomes the child's internal standard. Unspoken rules. What's celebrated versus what's ignored or punished. Cultural and social programming. Cultural values and societal messages also become incorporated into the critic's repertoire. Achievement cultures create critics focused on performance and comparison. Conformity cultures develop critics that attack uniqueness or standing out religious contexts, may foster critics that speak in terms of sin, virtue, or divine judgment. Gender expectations create critics that enforce appropriate ways of being male, female, or other. The protective intention. Here's what's essential to remember. The inner critic initially develops as a protective mechanism. By internalizing parental standards and cultural warnings, a child gains a measure of control in a world where belonging to the family and social group is essential for survival. The critic attempts to keep us safe by ensuring we follow group norms to maintain belonging, anticipating others' reactions so we can modify behavior, preventing behaviors that might lead to rejection or punishment, maintaining connection to caregivers through compliance. While this protection often comes at the high cost of authentic self-expression, acknowledging this protective intention becomes crucial for transformation rather than simply fighting against the critic. Factors that intensify the critic. Not everyone develops an equally harsh inner critic. Several factors determine the critic's intensity. Attachment security, secure attachment, more balanced, guidance-oriented internal voice, insecure attachment, harsher, more punitive critic to manage relationship anxiety. Parental mental health. Parents with untreated depression, anxiety, or trauma often transmit harsher critics. Parents' own inner critics get passed down through modeling and emotional responses. Consistency of care, predictable, warm responses, gentler internal guidance, inconsistent or harsh responses, hypervigilant, punitive critic. Trauma and adversity, single incidents versus chronic stress. Age when trauma occurred, presence or absence of support during difficult times. Temperament, highly sensitive children often develop more intense critics, children who are naturally more reactive to environmental input. Children who experience significant trauma develop what we might call a trauma critic, an intensified version that operates as a survival mechanism in threatening environments. This critic becomes hyperactive in an attempt to prevent further harm by controlling behavior to an extreme degree. What might have been a moderating voice becomes a tyrannical one, demanding perfection as the price of safety. This trauma critic often carries these messages. You must be perfect to avoid punishment. Any mistake could be life-threatening. You're fundamentally damaged goods. Others can't be trusted, so you must control everything. Why this knowledge matters. Understanding how your critic formed isn't just interesting psychology, it's the foundation for transformation. When you recognize that your critic, developed through unconscious defense mechanisms, formed during vulnerable developmental periods, carries the voices and values of your early environment. Originally intended to protect you, you can begin to relate to it differently. Instead of seeing it as your true voice or an accurate assessment of reality, you can recognize it as a part of your psyche that developed under specific circumstances and can be updated with new information. Preparation for transformation. In our upcoming installments, we'll explore how to dialogue with your critic rather than being dominated by it. Methods for updating the critic's outdated protective strategies. Ways to access the authentic guidance that lies beyond the critic-specific practices for healing the developmental wounds that fuel the harshest criticism. But all of this transformational work becomes possible only when you first understand the critic as a developmental adaptation rather than ultimate truth. In our next installment, we'll explore how developmental trauma amplifies the inner critic and examine the neuroscience behind self-criticism. We'll discover how adverse childhood experiences create hypervigilant critics, the brain circuits involved in self-criticism and self-compassion, why trauma critics are particularly resistant to change, how the nervous system gets wired for self-attack versus self-support, cultural and social influences that feed the critic in modern life. We'll also begin exploring how different personality types, using the Enneagram, develop characteristic critic patterns, giving you more specific insight into your own inner landscape. As we close this exploration of how the inner critic forms, I invite you to reflect on your own critic's development. Questions for reflection. Which of Erickson's stages resonates most strongly with your critic's themes? What messages did you absorb from your early environment? How did your family handle mistakes, emotions, and autonomy? What cultural or social values became part of your critic's voice? Can you recognize the protective intention behind your critic's harshest messages? Remember, this isn't about blaming your parents or early environment. Most caregivers did their best with their own unhealed wounds and limited awareness. This exploration is about understanding so you can transform. Thank you for joining me in this deep exploration of how the inner critic forms. Understanding these developmental foundations gives you tremendous power. The power to recognize that your critic's voice, however convincing it may seem, is not ultimate truth, but rather a protective adaptation that developed under specific circumstances. For our Genius Circle community, this understanding becomes the foundation for conscious transformation. When we know how something was created, we gain insight into how it can be recreated differently. I encourage you to be gentle with yourself as you digest this information. Sometimes understanding our developmental story can bring up sadness, anger, or grief about what we needed but didn't receive. These feelings are natural and important parts of the healing process. In our next installment, we'll explore how trauma amplifies these developmental patterns and begin to understand the neuroscience that will help us work more effectively with transformation. Until then, may you hold your own development story with compassion, recognizing both the wounds and the incredible resilience that brought you to this moment of conscious growth. This is Dr. Bren for the Genius Circle community. I'll see you in part 3 where we continue this essential journey together.